Get out of the car. Now. The voice thundered through the parking garage, sharp and cutting, echoing against the concrete walls. She froze, her hand still gripping the strap of her leather briefcase. The badge clipped to her belt glinted under the dim overhead light, but he didn't see it. Or maybe he didn't care. I said, out of the car. The officer's boots pounded toward her. She barely had time to step back before he grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the open car door. The force knocked her off balance, her heels scraping against the ground as she staggered. Wait, her voice came out calm but firm, though her pulse hammered beneath the surface. No talking. His grip tightened as he shoved her against the side of the car. Hands where I can see them. People had started to watch. A man walking toward the elevator slowed, clutching a cup of coffee. A woman in a suit paused, staring wide-eyed before quickly looking away. Officer, you're making a mistake. She kept her voice even, refusing to give him what he wanted, fear. Mistake. He barked out a laugh, low and bitter. You don't get to tell me what's a mistake. I saw you hanging around this car, looking shady as hell. And what's in that bag? Stolen goods. She felt the heat crawl up her neck. Not from embarrassment. From anger. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. Let me show you something. No. He shoved her harder against the car, ignoring the pain in her shoulder as it pressed into the metal. Hands on the hood. She tried again. I'm telling you, shut up. The words hit her like a slap, but this time, she didn't comply. She turned, slowly, deliberately, meeting his eyes. They flickered for a moment, uncertainty creeping in, but his hand hovered over the baton at his hip. Last warning, he said, his voice dropping lower. Or what? She asked. Her voice didn't shake. She stepped closer, daring him to act. But before he could respond, another voice rang out. Officer. He flinched, his head snapping toward the sound. Another man approached, his uniform crisp and decorated with more insignias than the one pressing her against the car. Sir. The officer straightened, dropping his grip but not stepping back. What the hell do you think you're doing? The man's voice carried authority, but the younger officer hesitated, glancing between the two of them. I caught her sneaking around this vehicle. Refused to show ID. Acting suspicious. She finally stepped away from the car, smoothing out her jacket with deliberate movements. I was suspicious. Her voice sliced through the air, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The older officer's face tightened as realization dawned, his eyes dropping to the badge still clipped to her belt. The younger officer followed his gaze, and froze. Chief, the word barely escaped his lips before he stumbled back, panic spreading like wildfire through his expression. That's right, she said, her voice sharp. Chief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stepped back again, his hands hovering near his belt as if deciding whether to retreat completely or stand his ground. The tension crackled between them, thicker than the humid air in the parking garage. She didn't move, didn't break eye contact, letting him squirm in the weight of his own mistake. But the damage had already been done. People were still staring. Phones had appeared, recording, documenting. And he knew it. You have no idea, she finally said, her voice low and steady, what you've just done. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, drenched in humiliation and disbelief. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. What followed shook the entire police department to its core. Careers were ruined. Secrets unraveled. And in the end, the officer who thought he had power learned just how quickly that power could be stripped away. What would happen next? How far could one mistake take a man down? And what would she do when faced with the chance to exact justice? This story isn't just about humiliation. It's about consequences, and the kind that no one ever sees coming. Stay with us to find out how it all unfolds. Hello, dear listener. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. This channel is a safe space for everyone, especially for our Black community, to feel seen, heard, and respected. Today's story touches on themes of prejudice and resilience, and we hope it inspires reflection and strength. Enjoy the story, and if you find it powerful, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to support more impactful narratives like this one. Now, sit back and get ready for an unforgettable journey. Let's dive into the story. The parking garage smelled of oil and damp concrete. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting uneven shadows across the rows of parked cars. It was late, and most of the building had emptied out hours ago, leaving only the hum of vending machines and the distant echo of footsteps. The weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders as she reached for the leather briefcase in the passenger seat of her sleek black sedan. The case was heavy, not just with documents, but with the responsibility it represented. Dana Lewis was used to the weight. She carried it every day, both figuratively and literally. As the chief of the FBI's Criminal Investigation Division, Dana had fought her way up through a system designed to keep her out. She had earned her title, her authority, and the respect of those who truly knew her. But respect was never automatic. It had to be demanded, claimed, and sometimes even fought for. Tonight, however, she wasn't thinking about respect. She was thinking about the case files stacked inside her briefcase, the missing girl, the cartel connections, the pressure from higher-ups to deliver results. Her heels clicked against the cold concrete as she locked the car, her mind already racing through strategies for tomorrow's meeting. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. Officer Ryan Cole was finishing his third double shift that week. He was tired, irritable, and looking for an excuse to take out the frustration simmering just beneath his skin. He saw her as soon as she stepped out of the car. The garage was practically deserted, and he didn't recognize her, just another woman dressed too sharply for a place like this, carrying a bag that looked expensive. He had seen it before, the entitlement, the arrogance. It made his stomach churn. People like her always thought they were above the rules, and it was his job to remind them that they weren't. Ryan wasn't always like this. At one point, he had been an idealist, joining the force to make a difference. But years of disappointments and compromises had turned him into someone he barely recognized anymore. He'd stopped seeing people, now, all he saw were threats. And in Dana, he saw just that. Dana didn't flinch when he shouted the first command. She was used to intimidation tactics, but something about the way he moved, the sharpness of his tone, the twitch in his fingers, set off alarms in her head. Her badge was clipped to her belt, but she knew better than to reach for it without warning. She had seen too many incidents spiral out of control because someone moved too fast. She tried to speak, to explain, but he didn't give her the chance. His hands were on her before she could react, his grip firm and unrelenting as he shoved her against the car. The humiliation hit her like a wave, not because she was powerless, but because she knew she wasn't. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. Her title, her accomplishments, her authority, none of it shielded her from the reality of how quickly someone could strip all of that away. Ryan didn't notice the badge at first. All he saw was the flash of anger in her eyes, and it made him push harder. He wanted to break that look, to remind her who was in charge. But as the seconds dragged on, something shifted. The tension in her body didn't read like guilt, it read like control. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't pleading. She was waiting. When he finally saw the badge, his stomach dropped. His hands fell away like he had touched fire. The name on it hit him even harder, Chief Dana Lewis. He knew the name. Everyone in law enforcement did. She was the kind of figure who got mentioned in hushed tones, her reputation as sharp as her instincts. And now she was staring at him like she could see straight through him. Ryan stammered out half an apology, but Dana didn't let him finish. She didn't need to. The damage was already done, and the way the nearby bystanders had frozen, phones in hand, made it clear that this moment was far from over. The garage felt smaller now, the walls closing in around Ryan as Dana adjusted her jacket, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't yell or curse. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice low and deliberate. "You'll regret this," she said. "And not because of me. Because of you." Ryan didn't sleep that night. The humiliation that had been so satisfying to deliver earlier now sat heavily in his chest. He replayed the moment over and over, trying to convince himself that he wasn't wrong, that she had deserved it somehow. But deep down, he knew better. Dana, on the other hand, didn't have the luxury of dwelling on it. She had bigger battles to fight, but this wasn't one she could ignore. Her mind churned with questions. How many others had Ryan treated like this? How many hadn't been able to push back? She hadn't just been humiliated, she'd been reminded, in the most personal way, why she did what she did. By morning, the incident had already started to spread. Video footage surfaced online. Whispers turned into questions, and questions turned into demands for accountability. Ryan's name circulated through headlines alongside words like abuse of power and racial profiling. But the real storm hadn't hit yet. Dana knew this was just the beginning. And as much as Ryan tried to convince himself that it would all blow over, he couldn't shake the feeling that his career, and his life, was about to unravel. What neither of them knew was just how far the fallout would reach. The investigation that followed would pull skeletons from closets, revealing truths that no one saw coming. Dana was prepared for it. Ryan wasn't. And as the walls closed in, both of them would have to face the consequences of that night in ways neither of them could have imagined. The air inside the FBI headquarters felt heavier than usual. Dana sat at the edge of her desk, her fingers pressed tightly around a pen she hadn't touched in minutes. The video had gone viral overnight. Millions of views. Hundreds of comments. Some praised her composure. Others questioned why someone in her position had been treated that way in the first place. And then there were the trolls, those who blamed her, who said she must have done something to provoke it. She didn't bother reading those anymore. Her phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another article dissecting what had happened in the garage. She flipped it over, resisting the urge to check. Instead, her eyes drifted to the open door of her office, where voices echoed faintly from the hallway. "You really think they'll let this slide? They don't have a choice. She's too high up. If they try to bury this, it'll blow up even bigger." Dana exhaled sharply, pushing herself to her feet. She couldn't let this consume her. Not when there were bigger fights ahead. But as she reached for the folder on her desk, the knock at her door stopped her cold. Ryan Cole stood in the doorway. He looked different. Gone was the arrogance, the puffed-up bravado she had seen in the garage. In its place was something smaller, more desperate. He hesitated, his hand still on the frame as if he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to step inside. Dana didn't invite him in. "Chief Lewis," he started, his voice tight. She didn't respond. She let the silence stretch, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry." Dana leaned back against her desk, crossing her arms. "You're sorry," she repeated, her tone flat. "Yes. What happened, what happened?" Her voice cut through the room, sharp and cold. "You want to talk about what happened? Because from where I'm standing, what happened was an abuse of power. What happened was a public humiliation. What happened was you deciding that my skin color and the way I looked were enough to make me a suspect." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I wasn't thinking," he said after a moment. "No," Dana snapped. "You were thinking. That's the problem. You made assumptions, and you acted on them. And now you're here, hoping an apology will fix it. But let me be clear, an apology doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't erase the fact that you thought you had the right to treat me like I didn't belong. Ryan's shoulders sagged. I know, he said quietly. And I'll accept whatever consequences come from this. But I need you to know, I'm not that guy. Dana pushed off the desk, stepping closer. You are that guy. At least, you were that night. So the real question is, who are you going to be now? Ryan didn't have an answer. He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, Dana sank into her chair. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't let it show. Not here. Not now. She had work to do. But the fallout wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Dana sat in the conference room with her senior team, the tension palpable. Across the table, Special Agent Marcus Reed shuffled through a stack of reports, his expression grim. This isn't going away, he said finally. Internal affairs is already involved, but the press isn't going to let this die quietly. They want accountability. Dana nodded. Good. Let them. This isn't just about me, it's about the culture we're up against. And if this case shines a light on it, so be it. Marcus hesitated, flipping through another page. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice. We ran a deeper background check on Cole. There's more. Complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Most of them were buried or dismissed, but, Dana's stomach tightened. But what? But there's one that's still open. And it's bad. How bad? Marcus looked up, his eyes dark. Criminal bad. Dana sat back, her mind already racing. She should have seen this coming. The signs had been there, too much confidence, too much anger. But this wasn't just about one man anymore. This was about a system that let him thrive. As the meeting ended and her team filed out, Dana stayed behind, staring out the window at the city below. She had spent her entire career fighting for moments like this, for the chance to change things, to fix what was broken. But the stakes had never felt higher. Meanwhile, Ryan sat in his apartment, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the news articles. His face was everywhere, screenshots from the video, headlines calling for his resignation. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but it wouldn't change anything. He had tried to apologize. He had tried to explain. But it wasn't enough. Nothing he did now would be enough. And then his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. Cole. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate. You need to be careful. Ryan frowned. Who is this? Someone who knows what's coming. You're not the only one they're looking at. And if you don't start talking, you're going to take the fall for all of it. The line went dead. Ryan stared at the phone, his heart racing. He didn't know who had called, but he knew one thing, whatever storm was coming, he wasn't ready for it. And neither was Dana. Because as the investigation deepened, it wasn't just Ryan's secrets that came to light. Dana's own past began to surface, connections she thought were buried, alliances she had trusted, and decisions she had made in the name of justice. The pieces were falling into place. But the picture they formed was far more dangerous than either of them had realized. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to shrink with every passing second. The dim, artificial light above cast harsh shadows that stretched across the cold concrete floor, making the space feel even smaller than it already was. Dana stood near the edge of the metal table, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her posture rigid. Her eyes never left Ryan, who sat slumped in a chair across from her, his shoulders hunched and his gaze fixed somewhere on the table. He looked different now, stripped of the authority and arrogance he had carried the first time they crossed paths. The clean, pressed uniform was gone, replaced by a wrinkled button-down shirt that hung loosely on his frame. His sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, revealing faint bruises near his wrists, and his hands trembled as he rubbed his palms nervously against his jeans. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, told the story of a man who hadn't slept in days. Dana let the silence stretch, letting the weight of it press down on him like a slow, suffocating force. She didn't speak. Not yet. She wanted him to feel it, to sit in the discomfort of the moment and let the tension build until he had no choice but to break. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his legs bouncing slightly under the table, but he still didn't look up. She could see it all over him, the shame, the fear, the unraveling of the carefully constructed image he had once projected. But sympathy wasn't why she was here. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but sharp, each word carefully measured. "I gave you a chance, Ryan. I gave you an opportunity to come clean, to take responsibility for what you did, and to fix it before it was too late. But you didn't. You tried to cover it up. You lied. And now, here we are." Ryan flinched at her words, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Dana stepped closer to the table, her heels clicking against the floor and echoing through the silent room. "Do you have any idea how many complaints I found when I dug into your record? How many times you walked away without consequences? How many people suffered because of you?" She leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You didn't just cross the line, Ryan. You erased it completely. And you thought no one would ever catch up to you." Ryan's voice cracked when he finally spoke, his words barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't know it would go this far." Dana slammed her hand down on the table, the loud impact making him jump. "You didn't know. Don't give me that. You knew exactly what you were doing. You made a choice, over and over again. And now you want me to believe that you didn't think it mattered?" Ryan winced but didn't back down this time. "I didn't think it mattered," he admitted. "Not until you." Dana's eyes narrowed. "It always mattered," she said, her voice steady and cold. He swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I know that now. But it's too late, isn't it?" Dana straightened, her arms dropping to her sides. "That depends," she said. "Because right now, you have a choice. You can keep hiding behind excuses and pretending this was just one mistake, or you can tell me the truth about what you've been involved in. And if you choose wrong, Ryan, I promise you won't just lose your badge, you'll lose everything." Ryan's breath hitched, and for a moment, Dana thought he might crack. His hands were shaking as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. He slid it across the table without looking at her. Dana picked it up, her fingers flipping through the contents quickly. Bank statements. Transaction records. Payments that didn't make sense. "What is this?" Ryan's voice was hollow. "Proof," he said. Dana's stomach tightened. "Proof of what?" Ryan leaned back in the chair, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his secrets had finally crushed him. "They paid me," he said. "Not just once. Over and over again. To keep quiet. To look the other way. Drugs. Trafficking. Dirty cops. It's all connected. And I let it happen." Dana's pulse quickened, but she kept her face calm. "Who's they?" Ryan shook his head. "You don't get it. These people don't just disappear. They don't let go. If I talk, if I tell you everything, I'm dead." Dana stepped back, her thoughts spinning. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. And it was dangerous. But she didn't let him see the doubt flicker across her face. Instead, she locked eyes with him and spoke with unwavering resolve. "You've already lost everything, Ryan. The only thing you can do now is decide how this ends." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his fingers trembling against the table. Finally, he nodded. Dana's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She turned toward the door and motioned for Marcus to step inside. "We need to get him somewhere safe," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. But before Marcus could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder with every step. Dana's instincts flared, and her hand moved instinctively toward her weapon just as the door burst open. Two men in dark suits stood there, their expressions cold and unreadable. "Chief Lewis," one of them said, flashing a badge. "We need to take him into custody." Dana stepped in front of Ryan, her body shielding him from the men. "Not happening," she said, her tone like steel. The man's expression didn't waver. "You don't have the authority to stop this." Dana's voice dropped, each word deliberate and cutting. "Try me." The room seemed to vibrate with tension as the men stepped closer, their eyes locked on Dana. Ryan's breathing quickened behind her, and for the first time, Dana felt the full weight of what she had walked into. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about survival. And as the men reached for their weapons, Dana knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next would change everything. The room felt like it was closing in, every breath heavier than the last. Dana didn't flinch as the two men in suits stepped closer, their movements controlled but deliberate. Her hand remained steady near her weapon, fingers lightly grazing the holster, but she didn't draw. Not yet. She needed to keep the situation contained, no matter how fast her pulse raced beneath the surface. She could feel Ryan behind her, frozen, his breath shallow and uneven. She didn't turn to look at him, but she could hear the panic in the way he shifted his weight, his chair scraping slightly against the floor. The two men stopped just feet away, their eyes cold and assessing. One of them, taller and broader, stepped forward and spoke first. "You're obstructing an official investigation, Chief Lewis. Stand down and let us do our job." Dana's voice was sharp but steady. "Your job? What job is that, exactly? Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot more like intimidation than law enforcement." The man's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're dealing with here." Dana didn't blink. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. Corruption. Cover-ups. Threats. And now you're trying to clean up the mess before anyone else gets the chance to see it. But it's too late for that, isn't it? The truth is already out." The second man, leaner with sharp features, finally spoke. His voice was quieter but carried an edge that made Dana's skin crawl. "You're making a mistake, Chief. You think you can protect him? You think you can protect yourself? You have no idea how deep this goes." Dana stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "I don't need to know how deep it goes. I just need to know that it stops here." The taller man's voice dropped, low and deliberate. "You're gambling with your career. With your life. Walk away now, and we'll forget this ever happened." Dana's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "You think this is about my career? You think I'm scared to lose a title? Let me tell you something. I've spent my entire life fighting to be in this position, and I didn't get here by walking away when things got hard. So if you're looking for someone who's going to back down, you're in the wrong room." The second man stepped closer, his hand hovering near his own holster, and Dana's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "Don't do this, Lewis," he said. "You're outnumbered. Outmaneuvered. You can't win this fight." Dana's eyes narrowed. "Watch me." The tension in the room was electric, every movement deliberate, every breath calculated. Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out shaky. "I'll talk," he said suddenly, breaking the standoff. "I'll tell her everything." The two men turned toward him, their expressions darkening. "Don't," the taller man warned, but Ryan pushed his chair back and stood, his legs trembling beneath him. No, he said, louder this time. I'm done being scared. I'm done letting you control me. I should have done this a long time ago. Dana stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself between Ryan and the men without losing sight of either. You're not touching him, she said firmly. The taller man's eyes darted to the door as if calculating his next move, but Dana was already one step ahead. I called for backup before I came in here, she said. You think you can make this go away? Go ahead and try. But you're running out of time. The leaner man smirked. You think they'll get here before we do what we need to do? Dana's voice hardened. Try it. See what happens. The taller man stepped back slightly, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. This isn't over. Dana didn't move. You're right about that. It's just getting started. They hesitated for a moment longer before finally backing toward the door. The leaner man's eyes lingered on Dana as he spoke one final warning. You don't know what you've unleashed. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Ryan sank back into the chair, his hands shaking as he dragged them down his face. I can't do this, he said, his voice breaking. I can't. Dana rounded the table, her voice softer but still firm. Yes, you can. You already have. Now we finish it. He shook his head. You don't get it. They'll come for me. For my family. They'll destroy everything. Dana knelt in front of him, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me. You're not alone in this anymore. We're going to protect you, but you have to trust me. No more lies. No more secrets. You have to give me everything. Ryan swallowed hard and nodded, but his eyes were still clouded with fear. It's bad, he whispered. Worse than you think. They've got people everywhere. Judges. Politicians. It doesn't stop at the department. They're pulling strings at the highest levels. Dana's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. Then we'll pull harder. Ryan leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something else. Something I haven't told you. Dana's breath caught. What is it? Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if he expected it to burst open again at any second. The evidence, they've been moving it. Hiding it. But I know where it is. Dana's pulse quickened. Where? Ryan's voice dropped even lower. A warehouse. Off the docks. But it's not just files. It's people. Trafficking. They're keeping them there. Dana's blood ran cold. When? Tonight, he said. They're moving them tonight. Dana stood, her mind already racing with plans. Then we don't have time to wait. Ryan looked up at her, his expression torn between desperation and determination. What if we're too late? Dana's voice was steady, but there was fire behind it. We won't be. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't heavy with fear. It was charged with purpose. And as Dana reached for her phone to make the call that would set everything in motion, she knew there was no turning back. The night was heavy with tension as Dana and her team moved through the industrial docks, their footsteps muffled against the damp pavement. The air smelled of salt and diesel, mixing with the faint metallic tang of rust from the cargo containers that lined the lot like looming shadows. Dana's grip tightened on her weapon as she scanned the area, her breath controlled but her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Ryan was just behind her, his face pale and glistening with sweat under the dim security lights that flickered overhead. She glanced at him, her voice low but sharp. You stay close. Don't do anything unless I say so. Understood? He nodded quickly, but Dana didn't miss the tremble in his hands as he adjusted his bulletproof vest. She knew he was terrified. She was, too. But fear couldn't dictate their actions, not tonight. The stakes were too high, and the clock was ticking. Marcus signaled from the far end of the lot and Dana moved swiftly toward him, crouching behind a stack of crates. He pointed toward a large warehouse with faded white lettering across its side. The windows were boarded up, but faint light seeped through cracks in the wood. "2 guards at the entrance," Marcus murmured. "Looks like more inside. No sign of movement in or out, but we've got eyes on at least 3 vehicles parked around the back." Dana exhaled slowly, calculating the next steps. "We move in quiet. Take the guards fast. Once we're inside, we secure the hostages first. Ryan stays with me, he's the only one who knows the layout." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Ryan. "You sure about that?" Dana's gaze hardened. "I don't have a choice." Ryan swallowed, his voice barely audible. "I won't screw this up." Dana didn't respond. She couldn't afford to make promises she wasn't sure she could keep, and right now, Ryan was as much a liability as he was an asset. But she needed him. He knew the building. He knew the players involved. And despite everything, she had to believe that he wanted to make this right. The approach was quick and silent. The guards never saw it coming. Dana moved with practiced precision, neutralizing the first one before he could even raise his weapon. Marcus took care of the second, and within seconds, the path was clear. Ryan hovered near the doorway, his breathing shallow, but he followed as Dana pushed forward, her gun raised as she signaled for the others to fall in behind her. Inside, the warehouse was darker than she expected, the air thick with the smell of sweat and mildew. The faint hum of machinery echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, but what caught Dana's attention first was the row of cages. Metal bars lined the far wall, and behind them, shadows moved, figures huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Dana's stomach tightened, but there was no time to hesitate. She signaled for Marcus and the others to secure the area as she approached the first cage. The woman inside flinched, pressing herself against the bars as Dana crouched down. "We're here to get you out," Dana said softly. "Stay calm. We're going to get you out of here." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Dana turned back to Ryan, who stood frozen a few steps behind her. "Keys. Where are they?" Ryan blinked, then shook himself out of his daze. "Office. Far end of the hall. Second door on the right." Dana motioned for Marcus to go, then turned back to Ryan. "Stay with me," she ordered. They moved deeper into the building, the dim light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Dana's senses stayed sharp, her every step calculated. But just as they reached the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end. Ryan froze, his eyes wide. "It's them," he whispered. Dana shoved him against the wall, motioning for silence. The footsteps grew louder, and then voices, 2 men, laughing and talking casually. Dana tightened her grip on her weapon, waiting. The moment they stepped into view, she moved. The first man didn't even have time to react before Dana had him pinned against the wall, his weapon knocked from his hand. The second lunged, but Ryan surprised them both, tackling him to the ground before Dana could get a clear shot. The struggle was quick but brutal. Dana disarmed the first man while Ryan fought to restrain the second. For a moment, Dana thought he might lose, but then he twisted sharply, forcing the man's arm back until he cried out in pain. Dana stepped in, securing the man with a pair of zip ties before turning to Ryan. "You good?" Ryan nodded, breathless but steady. "Yeah." Dana didn't waste time. She motioned for Marcus, who had returned with the keys, and together they started unlocking the cages. The relief on the faces of the captives was palpable, but Dana didn't let herself feel it yet. Not until they were out. As they moved the hostages toward the exit, Ryan hung back, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. Dana noticed. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated. "There's more," he said finally. Dana's stomach sank. What do you mean, more? Ryan swallowed hard. The files. The ones I told you about. They're not just evidence. They're leverage. Blackmail. Names, records, everything. And if we don't take them with us, this doesn't end. Not really. Dana stared at him, her mind racing. She knew what he was asking, one more risk, one more push. But he was right. If they left the files behind, the people who ran this operation would find a way to rebuild. She exhaled slowly. Show me. Ryan led her down a narrow corridor to a locked room at the back of the warehouse. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and hard drives. Dana's eyes scanned the labels, each one marking names and dates. We don't have time to go through it all, Ryan said. Dana nodded. Grab what you can. They loaded the evidence into bags as quickly as possible, the weight of every decision pressing down on Dana's shoulders. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. As they made their way back to the others, the sound of sirens finally cut through the night. Backup had arrived. But as Dana stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face, she knew the real fight was still ahead. The night air was sharp against Dana's skin as she stepped outside the warehouse, her boots crunching against the gravel. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness as backup poured in. Agents rushed past her, weapons drawn, shouting commands that blurred into background noise. Dana's focus stayed locked on Ryan, who stood a few feet away, his hand still shaking as he clutched one of the evidence bags they'd pulled from the back room. His eyes darted to the approaching vehicles, panic creeping back into his expression as if the walls were closing in again. Dana moved toward him, her voice steady but firm. You need to breathe. You're not going down for this. Not tonight. She reached out, grabbing his arm to anchor him, forcing him to meet her eyes. But you have to hold it together, Ryan. This isn't over, and I need you right now. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. What if they find a way to bury this? What if none of this matters? It matters, Dana snapped, her grip tightening. It matters because you're still here. Because those people inside are still breathing. Because we didn't let them win. But if you fall apart now, you're giving them exactly what they want. So don't. Not yet. Ryan's shoulders sagged, but he nodded, his breath slowing as he steadied himself. Dana released his arm and turned as Marcus approached, his face hard. We've secured the building, he said, his voice clipped. Hostages are safe, suspects are in custody, but it's a mess in there. We're going to need hours to catalog all of it. And there's something else. Dana felt the shift in his tone and braced herself. What is it? Marcus lowered his voice. The two agents who showed up earlier, the ones who tried to pull Ryan out, they're gone. Disappeared before we got here. No sign of them, no vehicles, nothing. It's like they vanished. Dana's jaw tightened, but she wasn't surprised. They'll surface, she said. They always do. And when they do, we'll be ready. Marcus hesitated. You think this ends with them? No, Dana said quietly, her eyes scanning the perimeter as more agents poured in. But it's a start. She turned back to Ryan, who stood rooted to the spot as if afraid to move. Her voice softened, but there was no less authority in it. You're coming with us. We'll keep you protected, but you need to start talking. Everything you know, everyone involved. No more hesitation. Ryan's voice cracked. You saw what they were willing to do. You think they'll stop now? Dana stepped closer, lowering her voice. No, I don't. But I also know that running isn't going to save you. This is bigger than you, Ryan. Bigger than me. And if we don't see it through, it's going to keep happening. People are going to keep getting hurt. Are you ready to let that happen? He shook his head quickly. No. No, I can't. Then you're going to fight, Dana said. You're going to stand up and fight because that's the only way this ends. The words hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Ryan exhaled, his shoulders straightening for the first time all night. I'll tell you everything, he said, his voice steadier now. But you have to promise me something. Dana raised an eyebrow. What? He looked her straight in the eye. You'll make sure they pay. All of them. Dana didn't hesitate. I will. The ride back to headquarters was tense and silent. Dana sat across from Ryan in the back of the armored vehicle, her eyes fixed on the evidence bags stacked beside them. Ryan fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, but he didn't speak until the city lights came into view. Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? He asked suddenly, his voice quiet but raw. Doing this. Fighting like this. Dana didn't look at him right away. Every day, she said finally. But then I remember what it feels like to let them win. And I can't live with that. Ryan nodded slowly, but she could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. He wasn't there yet. He might never be. But it didn't matter, not right now. Right now, all that mattered was keeping him alive long enough to finish what they started. When they pulled into the underground garage, Dana's stomach twisted. The last time she'd been here, Ryan had been the one holding the power, shoving her against her own car and treating her like she didn't belong. Now, he couldn't even meet her eyes as they stepped out of the vehicle. She stopped him just before they reached the elevator. You're not that guy anymore, she said. Not if you don't want to be. Ryan didn't respond, but the look he gave her was enough. He wanted to believe it. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. Dana's fingers tapped lightly against the handle of her gun as the doors slid open, and the sight of Director Caldwell waiting on the other side made her pulse quicken. Caldwell's face was unreadable as his eyes flicked between Dana and Ryan. My office. Now. Dana motioned for Ryan to follow, but he hesitated. You don't have a choice, she said under her breath. Let's go. Caldwell's office was dimly lit, the heavy blinds drawn shut. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the desk, arms crossed, as Dana and Ryan stepped inside. I've got agents downstairs cataloging evidence that ties half the city to organized crime, Dana said before Caldwell could speak. We found them. We stopped it. Caldwell didn't move. And what about him? Dana glanced at Ryan. He's cooperating. He gave us everything. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. And what's stopping him from running the second this is over? Dana stepped closer. Me. The silence stretched until Caldwell finally nodded. Get him in protective custody. And you, prepare for fallout. This isn't over. Dana's voice didn't waver. It never is. As they left the office, Ryan leaned in closer, his voice low. What if we can't stop all of it? Dana looked straight ahead. Then we keep going. Because stopping isn't an option. Dana stood in the dimly lit hallway outside the interrogation room, her hands resting on the table just beyond the glass. The reflection of her own face stared back at her, hard and unflinching, but the tension in her jaw betrayed the calm she was fighting to hold on to. Inside the room, Ryan sat with his elbows on the table, his fingers interlocked and his head slightly bowed. He hadn't spoken since they left Caldwell's office, and now, as she watched him through the glass, Dana could see the weight of the last 24 hours finally starting to break him down. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and pushed open the door. Ryan didn't look up when she entered. Dana pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, leaning forward with her hands flat on the table. She gave him a moment, letting the silence settle between them before she finally spoke. You need to talk to me, Ryan. If you keep shutting down, I can't help you. Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not sure anyone can help me now. Dana's eyes stayed locked on him, her voice steady but firm. That's not true. But you have to stop acting like this is already over. It's not. Ryan lifted his head, and for the first time, Dana saw something close to anger flash across his face. How do you know that? How can you sit there and tell me this is going to work out? You don't know what these people are capable of. You don't know how far they're willing to go. Dana didn't flinch. Then tell me. Make me understand. Ryan shook his head, his fingers tightening into fists. They don't leave loose ends, Dana. That's the first rule. That's what they told me when I took the first payment. Once you're in, you don't get out. And now I'm sitting here, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and you're telling me to act like everything's fine. It's not fine. Dana leaned in closer, her voice dropping. You're right. It's not fine. But you're here, Ryan. You're still breathing, and that means we still have a chance. If they wanted to kill you, they would have done it already. But they didn't. You know why? Because they're scared. You're dangerous to them now. And that's exactly why you need to keep pushing. Ryan stared at her, the anger in his eyes dimming as something else took its place, fear. What if I push too far? What if I drag you down with me? Dana's voice softened, but her words carried weight. I didn't get this far by playing it safe. I know what I'm doing. But I can't do it without you. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. I don't even know where to start. Dana reached into the folder she'd brought with her, pulling out one of the bank statements he had handed over earlier. Start with this. Tell me who signed off on it. Who made the calls? Ryan hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door, but Dana didn't let him look away. Ryan, she said, her voice cutting through his hesitation. Now. He swallowed hard, then pointed to one of the names highlighted on the page. It started with him. Gregson. He was the one who approached me, who told me how things worked. Dana's stomach tightened at the name. Gregson was high up, too high. This wasn't just corruption at the local level. It went deeper than that. And after Gregson? Ryan shook his head. After that, it blurred. Once you're in, you stop asking questions. Payments come through different channels, orders come from different voices. I stopped trying to keep track because the more I knew, the more dangerous it got. Dana tapped her fingers against the table, her mind already racing. That's why they tried to pull you out of here. They weren't just cleaning up loose ends. They're protecting something bigger. Ryan nodded, his voice hollow. Yeah. And whatever it is, it's big enough that they're willing to burn everything to the ground to keep it quiet. Dana leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room as the weight of his words settled in. This wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It wasn't even about the warehouse or the files they had recovered. It was about what those files represented, an entire network operating in the shadows, protected by people with enough power to make problems disappear. But Dana wasn't about to let that happen. She turned back to Ryan, her voice calm but commanding. We're going to break this open. But I need you to give me everything. Names. Dates. Connections. No more holding back. Ryan nodded, his hands still trembling, but there was something steadier in his voice this time. Okay. I'll give you everything. The door opened suddenly, and Marcus stepped inside, his face grim. We've got a problem, he said. Dana stood immediately, her body tensing. What is it? Marcus held up his phone. One of the suspects we took in, he's dead. Found in his holding cell 20 minutes ago. No sign of forced entry. Ryan's face drained of color, and Dana's stomach twisted. It wasn't a coincidence. They're already moving, Marcus said. We need to lock this down. Dana turned back to Ryan, her voice sharp. You're coming with me. Now. Ryan stood, his movements jerky but determined. What if they're already here? Dana's eyes hardened. Then we don't stop moving. The hallway outside was eerily quiet as they moved quickly toward the elevator, Marcus flanking Ryan while Dana led the way. Every step felt heavier, the echo of their footsteps ringing louder than it should have. When the doors slid open, Dana's hand instinctively went to her weapon, scanning the area before motioning for the others to follow. They stepped inside, the doors closing behind them with a dull thud. Ryan's voice broke the silence. How does this end? Dana didn't turn, her eyes fixed on the floor indicator as it counted down. It ends when we make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Ryan exhaled, but his voice was steadier this time. Then let's finish it. The elevator doors opened, and Dana stepped out first, her eyes sweeping the room. It wasn't over yet. Not even close. But for the first time, she felt it, the momentum shifting. And as she led them toward the next fight, she knew there was no turning back. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Dana stood near the prosecution table, her sharp suit pressed and her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. The air was thick, a mix of whispered conversations and shuffling papers as the audience filled the gallery. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised, ready to capture every word. Ryan sat a few feet away, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his shoulders rigid but his face calm. He hadn't been calm in days. But today, as the trial neared its conclusion, there was a determination in his eyes that Dana hadn't seen before. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, going through every piece of evidence, every document, and every recorded confession. The network they had exposed reached higher than she had imagined, politicians, judges, and law enforcement officers all entangled in a web of corruption and human trafficking. And now, with the case coming to a head, she wasn't about to let any of them slip through the cracks. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Dana's heart pounded, but her face remained unreadable. She had learned long ago how to hide the nerves that threatened to shake her, how to keep her voice steady even when the stakes felt insurmountable. The defense attorney stood first, delivering one last attempt to sow doubt, but Dana could see the cracks forming in his arguments. The jury's eyes had shifted over the last few days. Suspicion had turned to certainty. And as Dana rose to give her closing statement, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her like armor. She stepped forward, her heels echoing against the polished floor. The evidence you've seen isn't just paperwork. It's not just numbers and names. It's lives. Lives that were bought, sold, and discarded by people who thought they were untouchable. People who used their power not to protect others, but to protect themselves. And today, you have the chance to say no more. Her eyes locked with each juror, holding their gaze for a beat before moving on. This case isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about proving that no one, not even those in power, is above the law. It's about making sure this never happens again. When she sat down, Ryan exhaled beside her, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. Dana didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to think about what would happen if this went wrong. She kept her eyes on the judge, her breath steady, as the verdict was read. Guilty. The word rang through the room, and for the first time, Dana allowed herself to exhale. Guilty on all counts. Ryan slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling as relief flooded through him. Dana didn't move until the judge dismissed the court. Only then did she turn to Ryan. It's done, she said, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. Ryan shook his head. No. It's not done. Not for me. Dana didn't argue. She knew his battle was far from over. But he had faced his demons. He had owned his mistakes, and he had helped tear down the very system that had once protected him. For now, that was enough. Weeks later, Dana stood on the steps outside FBI headquarters, the sun warming her face as cameras flashed and microphones hovered near her. She answered each question carefully, her words measured but firm. The investigation had sent shockwaves through the city, toppling careers and exposing secrets that had been buried for years. But Dana knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be. She had seen what corruption looked like up close. She had felt its grip. And she knew how easily it could creep back in if people stopped paying attention. As the reporters packed up and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus stepped up beside her, holding a folder stuffed with new case files. "Ready for the next one?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Always," Dana said, her eyes scanning the street before turning back toward the building. Inside, Ryan sat in the witness protection office, signing the last of the paperwork that would give him a new identity and a new start. He had made mistakes, more than most people ever would. But Dana had seen something in him worth saving, and now it was up to him to prove her right. As he handed over the forms, he glanced up at the agent processing his case. "Do you think people like me ever really change?" The agent didn't look up. "That's not for me to decide. That's for you to prove." Ryan nodded, folding the last sheet of paper and tucking it into the folder. He wasn't sure if he deserved the chance he had been given, but he wasn't going to waste it. And as Dana sat at her desk later that night, going through the next round of reports, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She thought about the faces of the victims they had saved, about the lives that had been rebuilt because they refused to look away. She thought about Ryan and the long road ahead of him. And she thought about herself, the battles she had fought and the ones still waiting. Because justice wasn't a finish line. It was a constant fight. This story isn't just about corruption. It's about accountability. It's about what happens when people refuse to stay silent, when they refuse to let fear control them. It's about choices, the ones we make and the ones we're forced to live with. And now I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Did it challenge you to think differently about power, about justice, about second chances? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. There's always another twist waiting just around the corner.